Welcome. Looking forward to the party that follows this. So I have to say I was working on this at 3 o'clock in the morning and had far too much material. So I went through and slashed out a lot of slides. I'm now worrying that I haven't got enough. So you may get away early. We'll have to see. But I'm going to get a warning from Ash. I'll introduce myself a bit later in the presentation because I'm not your average AOTB attendee, I think. But what I'm going to be talking about is, whoops, wrong thing, get the technology right, is change and the fact that change, I think, is always difficult. And what I hope to do is spend a bit of time looking at this bit in the middle. What is it that actually makes change work? Looking at some of the evidence and various sort of research that's been done on change mechanisms that seem to, and change techniques that seem to deliver change that is actually effective and which sticks. But I'm going to do it in the context of the situation where you have little or no power, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are lots of scenarios that I think hopefully you'll recognise one or more of those from your own situation where you want to bring about change, you've maybe got some ideas, but you don't have the sort of executive authority to actually achieve it. I mean, I've spent my entire and now fairly long working career as a consultant. I've never actually had a proper job. And and so every situation I've gone into, I have no power. And so in order to get change to occur, I've had to use a wide variety of different techniques, and I'll be sharing some of my practical experience and looking at some of the theory. And even if you do have, wrong technology. Even if you are a manager and can do that executive thing, I want it done this way, I think there are still some useful things that you may learn in terms of achieving that effective and stickiness change that I think we're all looking for. So what am I going to do? I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my background because, as I say, I'm not your typical AOTB person. And then look at why change, some of the reasons why change is difficult, and then introduce you to some various bits of theory and thinking from various people who've done a lot more work than I have around change. And then I'm going to look specifically at one particular approach that I came across a few years ago called adaptive spaces, which I think, certainly talking to a few people today during the course of the day is very relevant, particularly in organisations where you're trying to roll out, and which reflects my background, where you're trying to roll out digital change or digitally driven change into production environments. And then finally, I'll wrap up with a few more specific practical techniques which I've been using, but I'm going to use a slide from somebody else that I think summarises it better than I can. Okay, so context, a bit about me. So my background is, for the last 30 years, I've been working as an independent consultant, working with my elevator pitch is effectively I work for charities and not-for-profits that deliver complex services, and I help them find and implement systems to support their service delivery activities. And you can see there a range of organisations that I've worked for over the years. And I suppose there are two or three characteristics of what I do. One is it's a start to finish thing. I tend to get asked in early on, we've got a problem, we need a new system to support case management for refugees, animal management system for the donkey sanctuary, call management, case management system for the RSPCA, and we need your help to actually work out what it is we want, find somebody to help us implement that, and then probably we'd like you to stay on and help you actually, like me to stay on and help them actually implement it. So I've seen, most of my projects have been 3 or 4 years long, and I've actually seen them right the way through to implementation. So I've had to live with the consequences of the decisions and recommendations that I've had to make. And I still have, in fact, That's actually, I had an investigation, but I still actually have the scars from some of those decisions that I've taken. And what I do is a mixture of sort of technology stuff, but also the change process as well. That if you're going to deliver business value from a digital project, for that to be successful, it's as much about changing the organisation, the processes and the people as it is about getting the technology right. So I've helped those organisations with that process. And you can see there some of the sort of specific areas. I suppose 2 particular points. Most of the projects I've worked on, there hasn't been an off-the-shelf solution. So they've been novel projects. We've had to work out what it is that the organisation needs, and most of them have fallen into the sort of the complex category, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So this presentation will draw on that experience of working with organisations, helping them bring about change around digital projects. But what I'm also going to do is refer to the work of a number of different people. I don't think I've got time to go through this, but a range of thinkers, from complexity specialists, neuroscientists, a political psychologist, another complexity person, and Esther Darby, whose work I came across a few years ago, I think is really good in terms of practical techniques for bringing about change within organisations. I'm a generalist. I'm a fox rather than a hedgehog. Foxes let's get this right. Foxes know a little about lots of things. Hedgehogs know one big thing. So I know a little about all the topics that I'm going to be talking about. But my aim in taking you through this is to give you some sort of tasting menu and a bit of signposting. And if you're interested, hopefully you can go off and find out more. I had intended to put together a reading list for this, a reference list. As I say, I was slightly up against it time-wise, but if anybody would like that reading list, my email address will be at the end, and don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and I will happily put that together. So I'm going to, in terms of talking about my experience, use one particular project that I worked on, which was with a group of organisations that works with refugees, and it was helping them build a case management system. And what we were trying to do, I mean, there are a number of objectives for it, but we were trying to do something different in that if you're in social work, in case management work, clients that you're working with, whether it's in child protection or social work or working with asylum seekers and refugees, they have complicated lives. And what we've seen with things, for example, around child abuse situations is that often the people working with those cases don't have the full picture. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand was doing. And what we tried to do with this particular project was, having done an initial exercise, we tried to produce something that was different to the average case management system, and which would, when the advisor or the caseworker actually opened the case up, they would immediately see what the issues were for that client and what was going on. So they wouldn't have to wade through a large amount of case notes. And I'm going to come back to this, but this was the design group that we put together, which worked, and I'm going to talk more about this a bit later on, but we ran a large number of workshops, and they were just a lovely group of people. And one of the advantages with working with refugee organisations is you get the best ever potluck lunches. I remember one particular, because a lot of the people who work for refugee organisations are refugees themselves. So the one that sticks in my mind was a Kashmiri pilau that we had, lovely group of people. So where next? So let's have a quick look at why change is difficult. And there are lots of reasons. I've picked out a few. Something that Esther Darby talks about, which we'll come back to, is that, and particularly why change is resisted, is that people don't like coercion. Again, I don't have time to go into the details, but if you go to a book, which I'll talk about in a minute, she actually provides some evidence to show that when you try and force change on people, it's resisted and often fails. Second reason why change is resisted is often due to fear. I was listening to the neuroscientist whose name I put up earlier, and Melissa Casey, and she's got a really good presentation. If you search for the neuroscience of human agility in organisation, it's a really fascinating talk about a number of different aspects of what happens when people are working in challenging environments. And one of the things she says is there's good evidence to show that when you're frightened, basically you stop thinking, and the brain goes into sort of panic mode. Another thing she talks about is that when you have to do things differently, that is literally exhausting. That she talks about the difference between your average drive home when the brain actually is just on tick over and is using a very small amount of energy. I think the figure that your brain uses about 30% of the body's energy. But if you're making the same length of journey and it's one that you haven't made before and there are roadworks and it's raining and it's late at night, we all know that when we get home we're absolutely exhausted, and the reason for that is that if your head was in a brain scan, what you would see is your head, essentially your brain lighting up because it's flooded with blood and your brain is working overtime. So if you're asking people to change, if you're asking them to work differently, it is literally exhausting for them. Another reason why people resist change is that most organisations seem to never stop changing, and one of my clients was the Arts Council, and when I started with them, they had just moved from having a single organisation that covered the whole country, and they'd split out all of the regional offices and made them independent. And in the time that I was working with them over a period, on and off over a period of about 6 years, as that came to an end, they decided actually they were going to move back to having a single autonomous organisation. And having worked in a number of organisations going through a number of different change processes, what you see is just a weariness and not, again, sort of state of mind as a new chief exec comes in and the first thing they want to do is change stuff. Another factor, which we'll come back to again later on, is just the fact that people have got their day job, and if they're having to think about how to change things as well, that is often an added burden, and the depth of thought that you need in order to think about how that change is going to be introduced in your area is just a major burden of your day-to-day job. And often the ideas that people come up with in terms of, it's a new firm of consultants have been brought in, and they've got the new latest gee-whiz technology or approach in terms of the change management, and what they're coming up with reflects a very poor understanding of the work that's actually been going on in the organisation. And one of the things we'll come back to a bit again later on, but it's just the fact that in most organisations, what's actually an awful lot of the work that makes that organisation work is going on under the surface, what it says in the procedure manuals and what managers think is happening versus what is actually going on. A lot of the frontline staff are through the informal processes that have very little visibility higher in the organisation, where frontline staff are actually making the systems work. And often the new processes take very little account of that informal process. And finally, this is from Karen Stenner, who's done some interesting work on the authoritarian predisposition. It's slightly depressing, but what she argues is that about 30% of the population essentially find change very difficult, and when they're confronted with change, and we see this with things like Trump and Brexit and so on, their reaction is an escalation in their hostility towards change. And she argues that a significant proportion of that, she has evidence to demonstrate it. I mean, her views are, I think, contentious, but I think it's an interesting perspective. And certainly, I think, reflects my experience that there are always some people for whom change is frightening, and their reaction towards it is essentially one of hostility. So, and this is often why traditional approaches don't work. And so sort of moving on to look at different ways of working. What I want to do is introduce Connelly. Now, just in terms of a show of hands, talking to people, some of you have definitely heard and some of you are using it. So in terms of, you put your hands up if you're familiar with Connelly. About half, maybe slightly less than half. So forgive me, I'll shoot through this very quickly, but this was something I came across a few years ago, and for me, it's proved enormously valuable in terms of guiding my work since. It's what's called a sense-making framework. It was invented effectively by a guy called Dave Snowden, and it's been published in the Harvard Business Review. It's 20 years old this year. And what it does is it guides you in terms of what sort of approach you should use for a given problem. It essentially argues that for different problem types, you need different approaches. So I've blanked out this is the framework, and what's nice about it, or what I like about it, is that it covers on this side the predictable world, and on this side the unpredictable world. And adding a bit of detail to that, there are 5 domains. So on the predictable side, you've got the clear domain, which is where the solution is obvious. And everybody agrees the solution is obvious, and it's just a question of working out what the right solution is. And typically you can find that solution off the shelf. And the mode of working in all of these, there's a blue thing here that sort of tells you how to tackle it. So with a clear approach, it's a question of sensing the problem and then just categorizing it, working out what the right solution is, and then responding, which is implementing it. And typically you're implementing best practice. I'm going to blank out one of the things Snowden talks a lot about, which is important but don't have time to cover today, is constraints. I'm going to blank those out on the remaining slides. Then we've got the complicated domain, which is still predictable, but this time the solution isn't immediately obvious, but is amenable to analysis. You can break the problem down, you can solve the individual problems, and then when you reassemble those individual solutions and put them together, they work in a predictable way. And classic examples of complicated problems or complicated systems are things like Swiss watches, jet engines, anything from the engineering domain. And typically you're implementing good practice in the complicated domain. And then moving on to the complex domain. Now, complex problems are, there are rules, but they're only obvious in retrospect. The relationship between cause and effect. And two definitions of complex problems are either where you've got, they both apply, rich interconnectivity or messy entanglement. You've got lots of different components, they're all linked together, and there are complex relationships in terms of how they interact, and those components are changing over time. There's learning going on, so what works today doesn't necessarily, or what is true today is not necessarily true tomorrow. And classic examples of complex systems are things like weather systems, economic systems, but anything involving human beings and groups of human beings typically falls in the complex domain. And the method you use in working with, or the approach one uses in working with complex problems is small-scale experiments, effectively. Probe, familiar territory, I suspect, for most of you. Small-scale experiments. Probe, do something small scale, see whether it's working. If it does work, you amplify it. If it doesn't work, you learn from it, suppress it, and move on. Snowden talks about an exactive process, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about that. My preferred term is emergent. that your emergent practice, that solutions emerge over time when working in this way with complex problems. And then you've got the chaotic domain, which I'm not going to spend much time on. That's where you've got some sort of crisis. A fire in a building is the classic example there. You don't have time to do any analysis. You don't have any time to do any small-scale experiments. Basically, you have to act, see whether what you're doing is working, and adjust what you do. So, fire in a building, you head for the nearest exit. The exit is blocked by debris or smoke. And you have to adjust what you're doing in real time. But quite often, as we saw, a classic example, a more recent example of the chaotic domain is what happened in the early stages of the pandemic. And often what happens in the chaotic domain is you develop new and novel practices that potentially, and again we saw examples of that, can go on to become established practices. And then finally, there's the novel domain. And then finally, important in the Canadian model, but I'm not going to talk about it today, is the confused domain, which is you have yet to work out which of the other four domains the problem falls into. And Snowden has done a whole stack of work around the value of being actually knowingly confused and accepting that you don't know what to do. And that's the other A there is, and that is aporectic. You build your vocabulary listening to Snowden's talks, lots of words I hadn't heard before. So why am I talking about this? Because essentially, historically, a lot of change programs have assumed you can plan it out. If the big consultancies have their change management methodologies, we'll come in and we'll run a change program for you. And the reality is that, given what, change is always about people, and anything involving people is going to be complex. So those ordered techniques that exist on the right-hand side of the Canadian model, the reason why often they don't work is because the problem is actually not complicated. It's not in the ordered domain. It's a complex problem. And if you're working with complexity, there are lots of different theorists around the best way to work with complexity. Again, this draws largely on Snowden's thinking. A key thing about complex problems is that context is critical. What works in one situation, what looks like a similar situation, it may not work there. But the overall approach that Snowden advocates is set some sort of broad goal, sense where you are at the moment, understand the current situation, identify what you can easily change, steal and adapt ideas from other areas, which is the exaptation thing that I blanked out. Then design small safe-to-fail experiments, look for weak signals, and I think this is possibly, for me, is one of the most important things, that it's about looking at what's working and picking up early and listening, being curious, and not using traditional measures, but listening carefully to see whether what you're doing is actually delivering what you expected or not. The nature of this is that, and this is a challenge for a lot of organisations, that in the early stages of this, essentially you're having to live as an organisation with uncertainty, and most managers, most senior staff find that really difficult. If you go in, as a consultant, I have now learnt to say, I don't know what the answer is. It's taken me a lot of time, but it's the reality. And basically I say I've got a method whereby the solution will emerge. Learn from what works and what doesn't work, and then adjust what you do, and in particularly adjust your goals, that very often where you thought you wanted to be, is now somewhere different as a result of what you've learned. And as I say, through that process, the solution will emerge. So a few bits of other useful sort of background theory that I think are worth mentioning before we move on to, is that this comes from Melissa Casey again on the neuroscience, that effective change occurs when you have trust. That trust, when people trust you, then change becomes much easier. I won't go into the detail of the evidence for it, and maybe we can come back and cover that in the questions, but trust is key to successful change. And what she also argues, again from a neuroscience point of view, is that trust comes from stable relationships where there's a high degree of consistency, where people, when you say something as a colleague or as a manager, they can be confident that you will deliver on it and that you will, you will respect what you've said. Another thing that she talks about is that, again, people will work much harder to overcome problems when there is a purpose which they believe in. So about helping people understand your purpose, but again, adjusting the purpose in the light of what people actually want to achieve is really important. As I say, that comes from this particular video, which is definitely worth watching. Okay, so moving on from the theoretical to something more practical, I came across the concept of adaptive spaces, which originated from work by Michael Arena in General Motors, and which has been picked up by Mary Albeen. How many people have come across adaptive spaces? That's interesting. Mary Albeen is American. She's a professor of psychology, I think, in the States, but she's doing a lot of work in the NHS here. And if you Google her name, there are some very good introductory videos on it. But before we get on to what she says, the reason I like what she says is because it turned out that I was part of creating an adaptive space and I hadn't realised it. Going back to the case study, with the refugee organisations, we had 3 organisations, 6 teams and about 200 people, and we put together a design group pulling frontline staff out of the different teams. As I say, we had this idea, but when we started to introduce that idea to the people that we pulled out into the design group, there was a significant degree of puzzlement about it. But we went through an exercise of discovery with the whole group and looking both for common patterns in terms of how the different teams worked, but also looking at and accepting the differences. And what we did was we built some very early prototypes, very, very rough prototypes. And one of the dangers with that is that you only get one chance to make a first impression. And if you go too early with something, there's a real risk that you'll get seriously damaged. And we sailed. I can remember, feeling I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking into a bit of an abyss, because the first session that we did, workshop where we brought the design group in and they started using it, there was a lot of hostility to that approach and a lot of negativity. But over time, we spent time looking at what those problems were and trying to jointly solve those problems. And progressively, the ideas changed to reflect the feedback that we were getting from the frontline staff. We then ran a pilot project, and as I say, a workable solution started to emerge. And as a result of that, the design group became a lot more positive, and they became real advocates for the new system and were going back to their respective teams in the different organisations and infusing them. So when we actually came to do the rollout, there was quite a high degree of excitement. And given that it was it required people to think really differently in terms of how they did their work. So it was a major change for people, and by and large, it wasn't perfect. I mean, again, there's a whole conversation to be had about that. So anyway, we did that, and then subsequently I came across Mary Albeen and discovered that what we had done was built an adaptive space. So what is an adaptive space? And what I like about her ideas is that what she's identified, and which reflects my experience across multiple projects, is that you've got on the right-hand side various people who've got good ideas that they think are good that will improve matters. But then on the left-hand side, you've got the people who actually who are involved in the day-to-day work. And there is always a tension between those two. And what tends to happen in sort of more ordered approaches is that tension gets suppressed. The managers don't listen to it. And often there is valuable information in the, as we talked about, in the sort of in the reaction that you're getting from the production side. So what she advocates is this approach of building an adaptive space where you acknowledge and allow that tension, and she talks about a process of conflicting and connecting. So you allow the conflict to emerge, but you then look for common patterns, and out of that you start to build an adaptable approach that supports your future viability. And here you can see the pressures that I've been talking about in terms of particularly on the production side, of the need to produce your current results. And that, I think, is quite a good illustration of if you build that adaptive process and you have this space in the middle here where you can see through a process of networking and what she calls enabling leadership. You take the ideas from the entrepreneurial system, you're pulling in feedback and input from the operational side, and then over time, and one of the slides I cut out from my presentation is the importance of time. This doesn't happen overnight. Actually allowing time for people to think things through and to get used to ideas is, in my experience, really important. So, how are we doing for time? I've got one more slide, but I've got quite a lot to pack into this. What I'm going to do is move on to the work of Esther Darby, because again, a lot of her ideas, when I saw them, I thought, yes, this is absolutely right. And I'm just going to pick out a few bits and pieces. She's written a book that is now the 7 Rules of Change. I haven't actually worked out what the 7th rule is, but do people know this guy? He is a genius. He takes books and just on one page, he's definitely, if you follow him on Twitter and Instagram, he packs into a single A4 sheet a brilliant summary, and this is a talk which is available on, I think it's on Vimeo, of a talk given by Esther. And if you Google 6 Rules for Change, you'll find both this and the talk. And I'll just pick out a few things from this. She says, and to some extent this is the theme of what I've been saying, is that processes, traditional ordered processes that of driving change, installing change, evangelizing change, don't work. And she gives some evidence for that. And if you go to her book, she talks in more detail about that. I don't have time. She talks about, and this is, I think, a really important point, the importance of congruence. The need to balance your needs against and with the needs of others, and through a process of curiosity and listening and picking up on weak signals, reflecting back to people that they've been listened to is vital. But you also need to bring in the needs of the needs of the context, which is the needs of the organisation. And I think this is a rich concept. I've talked already about the fact that often change programmes don't ignore what people already know, and it's really important to spend time with the front line. And again, part of my practice is actually going and sitting with frontline caseworkers, RSPCA inspectors or whatever, and really spending time to understand what it is they do. And both, one of the things Snowden talks about in terms of complex systems is that what goes on in the organisation, which I've already said, is the official procedures versus the informal processes. It's often the informal processes that make the overall makes the organisation work. And by spending time and understanding the existing system remains a really important part of the change process. I've already talked about this, that people don't like, they resist coercion. Again, I've touched on this, and this assess what's possible. Again, one of the slides I cut out was one of the characteristics of a complex problem is something called dispositionality. You can move it more easily in one direction than you can in another. And I feel sure that you've all been in situations where you've introduced you have some ideas about how things will change, and you've gone to a group of people and said, here is my idea, and they just go, no. We're not, I don't want to use the polite term, but just go away. But if you spent some time with them beforehand and listened to them and tested a few things with them, you may well identify that actually rather than doing that, if you go this way, then they're going to be more amenable to change. And I mean, if there's time in the Q&A, I can give there's a study that was done on people who were vaccine resistant that showed that basically if you pick up on things that they are partially accepting of, then you're far more likely to get the change that you're seeking. I think this is a key point, and going back to my case study, finding people who are trusted within the organisation and working with them is, I think, vital for the success of any change programme. Again, with the refugee organisation, there was one manager, head of integration services in Scotland, and he early on said, I really like some of the ideas you're coming up with, and because he was well respected within the organisation and had his own network of contacts, he became a major advocate for change, and I think was one of the main reasons why the project. So working out who gets what you're talking about and supporting them and building that network. And again, one of the things I liked about the adaptive space was just the way in which over time, even those that were hostile towards the approach we were taking started to become advocates of the system, and were taking it back into their teams and saying, this system's going to be really useful in terms of helping us do our job better. And then I think this is an important point again from the refugee organisations, that trying to be too standardised is not a good thing, and trying to allowing for some local variation, I think, is often again a way of getting acceptance. If you enforce a process with too many standards, people will say that doesn't work here. But if you say, here are the broader things that you need to achieve, but within that you've got a reasonable degree of freedom, then again you're more likely to get success. And again, this is sort of classic Agile. Shouldn't rely on the technology. I don't think there's much more I want to add there. I mean, I guess one of the key, actually no, there is one final point, which is that certainly in my experience, that if you say to people who are hostile, look, if we just do this on a very small scale, find a way of doing it that we're not committing to it. If it doesn't work, we can roll it back. Then you're far more likely to get agreement than if you go in with something that involves a major change. So, I'm not doing too badly. We've got a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to be challenged if people have got observations or other things that they want to add to this. Please do so, because for me, one of the joys of the job I do is a continual learning experience. I've been, as you can probably gather, I'm old enough to, when I started programming, I was programming with punch cards. It shows how old I am. And the reason I love this job, or one of the reasons I love it, is just simply because it's a non-stop learning process. So if you've got observations or want to be critical, please feel free to do so. And if anybody does want a reading list, either DM me on Twitter or email me, and I'll put something together and I'm willing to share it.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got probably time for a couple of questions. If anyone has any questions.
Origin.
No, go ahead.
No, ladies first.
I was going to just say, the title of the talk is around...
Sorry, my hair is on.
the title of the talk is around catalysing that change when you've got limited or no power. But it strikes me that a lot of what the techniques and stuff you're talking about, even if you had the power to just say, well, we're going to change and do it this way, still not going to necessarily work. You still have to do all of that legwork around bringing people on board and getting the advocacy and the inside. And it's still about the influence rather than just having the power. So I guess a question or observation of like, yeah, what is the difference then between having the power and not having the power?
Absolutely agree. I mean, I think essentially, to some extent, this is a message for those that have the power as well. You know, that if you want change that works and where people are enthusiastic and will take it on and adopt it and make it work, then these techniques work in that situation. But by and large, imposed change. I mean, there was a quote I cut out, but it was basically, if you have power, you can change behaviour, but you won't change minds. And often, if you're not changing people's minds, you know, people have lots of ways of sabotaging things, you know, and making them not work. And so these techniques, I mean, it was the bottom line on one of my early slides saying this is relevant even if you do have the power. You're more likely to get a successful outcome using these sorts of techniques than if you use a sort of traditional, this is the way, here's a new set of things you're going to be doing from Monday. I can remember in the early days, the company I worked for, it wasn't me, but it was in the early days of Thatcher privatising government agencies, and one of my colleagues went in to run a training course for one of those agencies in which he was the person that announced to them that they were going to have to now do timesheets. You know, so this was sort of, you know, I think a fairly gentle backwater of government, and you know, it's just not the way to do it, basically. Right.
The same way, it doesn't happen overnight. Of course it doesn't. But what should leaders expect when they're embarking on a change? So what would be?
What, in terms of time?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's where the weak signals come in. You know, essentially, there is no right time. I mean, in the sense of it's all about context, and it's all about listening to what's working and what's not working, and backing stuff out if it's not working. And I mean, Esther Darby talks about the need for curiosity, sensitivity, careful listening, storytelling. I mean, Snowden, he's got this sense maker tool about, you know, that you can use on a larger scale in terms of gathering stories and sort of getting people to signify the importance of stories. So there are a lot of techniques, but it's about I mean, I think there's a natural cadence for anyone, and that may vary over time. You know, again, the nature of complex systems is that they change as people get used to new ways of working, and you can start to move more quickly. But for me, one of the big beasts I had with things like Scrum was that the feedback loop was the what do you call it, the show and tell. And in the sort of organisations I work with, that's just not enough time. You know, we took, I can't remember how long, but you know, those when we were doing that adaptive space process, that was several months of progressively building the system and just bringing people in and showing that they'd been listened to. You know, when they didn't like something, sometimes you'd say, actually, you'll get, you know, let's just leave it like that. We'll get used to it. And then other times you'd think, no, they're absolutely right. That isn't going to work. And it's that process of people feeling that they've been listened to. And even if they don't get what they want, if you've acknowledged the fact, if you go back to them and spend time again with them and say, you know, I heard what you said, but for this reason, we're not doing it now. And again, leaving the possibility open. It's all of those sorts of techniques, I think, are far more likely to engender acceptance and people being willing to sort of take on change that, you know, as I say, it comes back to that exhaustion thing. You know, change is exhausting, and I think we need to sort of recognise that, you know, particularly if you've got a day job, you know, where you're being KPI'd and things in terms of what you've got to do.
Okay. Go on then, one more.
Yeah, so how would you, say you've got a manager that is resistant to change, how would you go about kind of using these techniques to kind of nudge them towards being more adaptive?
So the question is, if you've got somebody who is resistant, and this was pre-Agile, this was my, I did a lot of when I had a proper job, working for a software consultancy. It was something that was taught to me by my sales manager, and yes, it's the back of the envelope, if people still have envelopes. Shows my age. There was an interesting thing on QI that now young people, when they signify phone, they do that, whereas my generation would do that. Is going to talk to somebody with an open mind and trying to get them to talk about the problems and challenges that they're facing. And you sort of and again, it's now co-design, but you basically sit with them and try and work out what it is that is going to excite them, what their problems are. And again, that feeling of being listened to. Don't pitch too early. It's about understanding them, understanding what they're trying to achieve, and giving them the sense that you're listening to what they want. Because the problem is, as soon as somebody said no, it becomes much more difficult to move forward in that situation. So, and again, that's why time is so important with these things. And I think that's where Agile potentially gets it wrong. There's this sort of, we've got to do things quickly. Sometimes doing things quickly is a good thing, but sometimes actually taking the time. I put, as I say, an adoption curve up that took it out. That sometimes actually giving people a bit of space to get used to something before you push it really helps them. People, again, with complex systems, people change their minds, and with projects, seeing projects as a learning experience. What I did a piece of work for the RSPCA looking at their development process, and one of the things I was working with the branch manager, and she said, and they'd had a project that had been really problematic, and she said basically what I said at the beginning of the project in terms of what I wanted, and having gone through it and seeing what I got and what I want now is something really different. So maximising your early learning opportunities, and in that sense of being listened to, I think is absolutely critical to getting people to say, actually, maybe we could do that. Just continually sort of gently probing. Don't put together, that's why the back of the envelope or post-it or whatever, working something out with them. And if you take them a half idea, do it as a sketch, and then you just scrunch it up. If they don't like it, straw man. If you don't like it, we can blow it away. Gone.
Okay. Right, can we have another massive round of applause?